Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Alex, Haley, Benjamin, Katie, Alb Ellie, and David. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue our education in agricultural machinery with more from Farm Engines and How to Run Them, the Young Engineer's Guide. A simple, practical handbook for experts as well as for amateurs, fully describing every part of an engine and boiler, giving full directions for the safe and economical management of both. Also, several hundred questions and answers often given in examinations for an engineer's license, and chapters on farm engine economy, with special attention to traction and gasoline farm engines, and a chapter on the science of successful threshing by James H. Stevenson and other expert engineers, with numerous illustrations showing the different parts of a boiler and engine, and nearly every make of traction engine, with a brief description of the distinctive points in each make. First published in 1903 by Frederick J. Drake & Co., Chicago, Illinois. Let's continue right where we left off at Chapter 9, in the middle of a question and answer section. Let's begin. Chapter 9, Points for the Young Engineer, continued. Miscellaneous. Question: what is foaming? Answer: the word is used to describe the rising of water in large bubbles or foam. You will detect it by noticing that the water in the glass gauge rises and falls, or is foamy. It is due to sediment in the boiler, or grease or other impurities in the feed supply. Shaking up the boiler will start foaming sometimes. At other times it will start without apparent cause. In such cases it is due to the steam trying to get through a thick crust on the surface of the water. Question: how may you prevent foaming? Answer: it may be checked for a moment by turning off the throttle, so giving the water a chance to settle. It is generally prevented by frequently using the surface blow-off to clear away the scum. Of course, the water must be kept as pure as possible, and especially should alkali water be avoided. Question: what is priming? Answer: priming is not the same as foaming, though it is often caused by foaming. Priming is the carrying of water into the steam cylinder with the steam. It is caused by various things beside foaming, for it may be found when the boiler is quite clean. A sudden and very hot fire may start priming. Priming sometimes follows lowering of the steam pressure. Often it is due to lack of capacity in the boiler, especially lack of steam space or lack of good circulation. Question: how can you detect priming? Answer: by the clicking sound it makes in the steam cylinder. The water in the gauge will go up and down violently. There will also be a shower of water from the exhaust. Question: what is the proper remedy for priming? Answer: if it is due to lack of capacity in the boiler, nothing can be done but get a new boiler. In other cases, it may be remedied by carrying less water in the boiler when that can be done safely, by taking steam from a different point in the steam dome, or if there is no dome, by using a long, dry pipe with perforation at the end. A larger steam pipe may help it, or it may be remedied by taking out the top row of flues. Leaky cylinder rings or a leaky valve may also have something to do with it. In all cases, these should be made steam tight. If the exhaust nozzle is choked up with grease or sediment, clean it out. A traction engine with small steam ports would prime quickly under forced speed. Question: how would you bank your fires? Answer: push the fire as far to the back of the firebox as possible and cover it over with very fine coal or with dry ashes. As large a portion as possible of the grate should be left open so that the air may pass over the fire. Close the damper tight. By banking your fires at night, you keep the boiler warm and can get up steam more quickly in the morning. Question: when water is left in the boiler with banked fire in cold weather, what precautions ought to be taken? Answer: the cocks in the glass water gauge should be closed and the drain cock at the bottom opened, for fear the water in the exposed gauge should freeze. Likewise, all drain cocks in steam cylinder and pump should be opened. Question: how should a traction engine be prepared for laying up during the winter? Answer: first, the outside of the boiler and engine should be thoroughly cleaned, seeing that all gummy oil or grease is removed. Then, give the outside of the boiler and smokestack a coat of asphalt paint or a coat of lamp black and linseed oil, or at any rate, a doping of grease. The outside of the boiler should be cleaned while it is hot, so that grease, etc., may be easily removed while soft. After the outside has been attended to, blow out the water at low pressure and thoroughly clean the inside in the usual way, taking out the handhole and manhole plates and scraping off all scale and sediment. After the boiler has been cleaned on the inside, fill it nearly full of water and pour upon the top a bucket of black oil. Then let the water out through the blow-off at the bottom. As the water goes down, it will leave a coating of oil down the sides of the boiler. All the brass fittings should be removed, including gauge cocks, check valves, safety valve, etc. Disconnect all pipes that may contain water to be sure none remains in any of them. Open all stuffing boxes and take out packing, for the packing will cause the parts they surround to rust. Finally, clean out the inside of the firebox and the fire flues, and give the ash pan a good coat of paint all over, inside as well as out. The inside of the cylinder should be well greased, which can be done by removing the cylinder head. See that the top of the smokestack is covered to keep out the weather. All brass fittings should be carefully packed and put away in a dry place. A little attention to the engine when you put it up will save twice as much time when you take it out next season, and besides, save many dollars of value in the life of the engine. Question: how should belting be cared for? Answer: first, keep belts free from dust and dirt. Never overload belts. Do not let oil or grease drip upon them. Never put any sticky or pasty grease on a belt. Never allow any animal oil or grease to touch a rubber belt, since it will destroy the life of the rubber. The grain or hair side should run next the pulley, as it holds better and is not so likely to slip. Rubber belts will be greatly improved if they are covered with a mixture of black lead and litharge, equal parts, mixed with boiled oil, and just enough Japan to dry them quickly. This mixture will do to put on places that peel. Question: what is the proper way to lace a belt? Answer: first, square the ends with a proper square, cutting them off to a nicety. Begin to lace in the middle and do not cross the laces on the pulley side. On that side, the lacing should run straight with the length of the belt. The holes in the belt should be punched if possible with an oval punch, the long diameter coinciding with the length of the belt. Make 2 rows of holes in each end of the belt so that the holes in each row will alternate with those in preceding row, making a zigzag. 4 holes will be required for a 3-inch belt in each end, 2 holes in each row. In a 6-inch belt, place 7 holes in each end, 4 in the row nearest the end. To find the length of a belt when the exact length cannot be measured conveniently, measure a straight line from the center of one pulley to the center of the other. Add together half the diameter of each pulley and multiply that by 3 1/4, 3.1416. The result added to twice the distance between the centers will give the total length of the belt. A belt will work best if it is allowed to sag just a trifle. The seam side of a rubber belt should be placed outward or away from the pulley. If such a belt slips, coat the inside with boiled linseed oil or soap. Cotton belting may be preserved by painting the pulley side while running with common paint, afterward applying soft oil or grease. If a belt slips, apply a little oil or soap to the pulley side. Question: how does the capacity of belts vary? Answer: in proportion to width and also to the speed. Double the width and you double the capacity. Also, within a certain limit, double the speed and you double the capacity. A belt should not be run over 5,000 feet per minute. One 4-inch belt will have the same capacity as 2 2-inch belts. Question: how are piston rods and valve rods packed so that the steam cannot escape around them? Answer: by packing placed in stuffing boxes. The stuffing is of some material that has a certain amount of elasticity, such as lamp wick, hemp, soapstone, etc., and certain patent preparations. The packing is held in place by a gland, as it is called, which acts to tighten the packing as the cap of the stuffing box is screwed up. Question: How would you repack a stuffing box? Answer. First, remove the cap and the gland, and with a proper tool take out all the old packing. Do not use any rough instrument like a file, which is liable to scratch the rod, for any injury to the smooth surface of the rod will make it leak steam or work hard. If patent packing is used, cut off a sufficient number of lengths to make the required rings. They should be exactly the right length to go around inside the stuffing box. If too long, they cannot be screwed up tight, as the ends will press together and cause irregularities. If too short, the ends will not meet and will leak steam. Cut the ends diagonally so that they will make a lap joint instead of a square one. When the stuffing box has been filled, place the gland in position and screw up tight. Afterwards, loosen the nuts a trifle, as the steam will cause the packing to expand usually. The stuffing box should be just as loose as it can be and not allow leakage of steam. If steam leaks, screw up the box a little tighter. If it still leaks, do not screw up as tight as you possibly can, but repack the box. If the stuffing box is too tight, either for the piston rod or valve steam, it will cause the engine to work hard and may groove the rods and spoil them. If hemp packing is used, pull the fibers out straight and free, getting rid of all knots and lumps. Twist together a few of the fibers, making 3 cords, and braid these 3 cords together and soak them with oil or grease. Wind around the rod till stuffing box is sufficiently full. Replace the gland and screw up as before. Stuffing box for water piston of pump may be packed as described above, but little oil or grease will be needed. Never pack the stuffing box too tight, or you may flute the rod and spoil it. Always keep the packing in a clean place, well covered up, never allowing any dust to get into it, for the dust or grit is liable to cut the rod. Chapter 10. Economy in running a farm engine. It is something to be able to run a farm engine and keep out of trouble. It is even a great deal if everything runs smoothly day in and day out, if the engine looks clean, and you can always develop the amount of power you need. You must be able to do this before you can give the fine points of engineering much consideration. When you come to the point where you are always able to keep out of trouble, you are probably ready to learn how you can make your engine do more work on less fuel than it does at present. In that direction, the best of us have an infinite amount to learn. It is a fact that in an ordinary farm engine, only about 4% of the coal energy is actually saved and used for work. The rest is lost, partly in the boiler, more largely in the engine. So we see what a splendid chance there is to save. If we are asked where all the lost energy goes to, we might reply in a general sort of way. A good deal goes up the smokestack in smoke or unused fuel. Some is radiated from the boiler in the form of heat, and is lost without producing any effect on the steam within the boiler. Some is lost in the cooling of the steam as it passes to the steam cylinder. Some is lost in the cooling of the cylinder itself after each stroke. Some is lost through the pressure on the back of the steam valve, causing a friction that requires a good deal of energy in the engine to overcome. Some is lost in friction in the bearings, stuffing boxes, etc. At each of these points, economy may be practiced if the engineer knows how to do it. We offer a few suggestions. Theory of steam power. As economy is a scientific question, we cannot study it intelligently without knowing something of the theory of heat, steam, and the transmission of power. There will be nothing technical in the following pages, and as soon as the theory is explained in simple language, any intelligent person will know for himself just what he ought to do in any given case. First, let us define or describe heat according to the scientific theory. Scientists suppose that all matter is made up of small particles called molecules, so small that they have never been seen. Each molecule is made up of still smaller particles called atoms. There is nothing smaller than an atom, and there are only about 65 different kinds of atoms, which are called elements, or rather, any substance made up of only one kind of atom is called an element. Thus, iron is an element, and so is zinc, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. But a substance like water is not an element, but a compound, since its molecules are made up of an atom of oxygen united with 2 atoms of hydrogen. Wood is made up of many different kinds of atoms united in various ways. Air is not a compound, but a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and a few other substances in small quantities. The reason why air is a mixture and not a compound is an interesting one, and brings us to our next point. In order to form a compound, 2 different kinds of atoms must have an attraction for each other. There is no attraction between oxygen and nitrogen, but there is great attraction between oxygen and carbon, and when they get a chance, they rush together like long-separated lovers. Anthracite coal is almost pure carbon. So is charcoal. Soft coal consists of carbon with which various other things are united, one of them being hydrogen. This is interesting and important because it accounts for a curious thing in firing up boilers with soft coal. We have already said that water is oxygen united with hydrogen. When soft coal burns, not only does the carbon unite with oxygen, but the hydrogen unites with oxygen and forms water or steam. While the boilers are cold, they will condense the water or steam in the smoke, just as a cold plate in a steamy room will condense water from the steamy air, so sweating. Now the scientists suppose that 2 or 3 atoms stick together by reason of their attraction for each other and form molecules. These molecules in turn stick together and form liquids and solids. The tighter they stick, the harder the substance. At the same time, these molecules are more or less loose and are constantly moving back and forth. In a solid like iron, they move very little, but a current of electricity through iron makes the molecules move in a peculiar way. In a liquid like water, the molecules cling together very loosely and may easily be pulled apart. In any gas, like air or steam, the molecules are entirely disconnected and are constantly trying to get farther apart. Heat, says the scientist, is nothing more or less than the movement of the molecules back and forth. Heat up a piece of iron in a hot furnace, and the molecules keep getting further and further apart, and the iron gets softer and softer till it becomes a liquid. If we take some liquid like water and heat it, the molecules get farther and farther apart till the water boils, as we say, or turns into steam. As steam, the molecules have broken apart entirely and are beating back and forth so rapidly that they have a tendency to push each other farther and farther apart. This pushing tendency is the cause of steam pressure. It also explains why steam has an expansive power. Heat, then, is the movement of the molecules back and forth. There are 3 fixed ranges in which they move. The small range makes a solid. The next range makes a liquid. The third range makes a gas, such as steam. These 3 states of matter, as affected by heat, are very sharp and definite. The point at which a solid turns to a liquid is called the melting point. The melting point of ice is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The point at which it turns to a gas is called the boiling point. With water, that is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The general tendency of heat is to push apart or expand, and when the heat is taken away, the substances contract. Let us consider our steam boiler. We saw that some different kinds of atoms have a strong tendency to rush together. For example, oxygen and carbon. The air is full of oxygen, and coal and wood are full of carbon. When they are raised to a certain temperature, and the molecules get loose enough so that they can tear themselves away from whatever they are attached to, they rush together with terrible force, which sets all surrounding molecules to vibrating faster than ever. This means that heat is given out. Another important thing is that when a solid changes to a liquid, or a liquid to a gas, it must take up a certain amount of heat to keep the molecules always just so far apart. That heat is said to become latent, for it will not show in a thermometer. It will not cause anything to expand, nor will it do any work. It merely serves to hold the molecules just so far apart. How energy is lost. We may now see some of the ways in which energy is lost. First, the air which goes into a firebox consists of nitrogen as well as oxygen. That nitrogen is only in the way and takes heat from the fire, which it carries out at the smokestack. Again, if the air cannot get through the bed of coals easily enough, or there is not enough of it so that every atom of carbon, etc., will find the right number of atoms of oxygen, some of the atoms of carbon will be torn off and united with oxygen, and the other atoms of carbon, left without any oxygen to unite with, will go floating out at the smokestack as black smoke. Also, the carbon and the oxygen cannot unite except at a certain temperature, and when fresh fuel is thrown on the fire it is cold, and a good many atoms of carbon, after being loosened up, get cooled off again before they have a chance to find an atom of oxygen, and so they too go floating off and are lost. If the smoke could be heated up, and there were enough oxygen mixed with it, the loose carbon would still burn and produce heat, and there would be an economy of fuel. This has given rise to smoke consumers and arranging two boilers so that when one is being fired, the heat from the other will catch the loose carbon before it gets away and burn it up. So we have these points. 1. Enough oxygen or air must get into the furnace so that every atom of carbon will have its atom of oxygen. This means that you must have a good draft and that the air must have a chance to get through the coal or other fuel. 2. The fuel must be kept hot enough all the time so that the carbon and oxygen can unite. Throwing on too much cold fuel at one time will lower the heat beyond the economical point and cause loss in thick smoke. 3. If the smoke can pass over a hot bed of coals or through a hot chamber, the carbon in it may still be burned. This suggests putting fuel at the front of the firebox a little at a time, so that its smoke will have to pass over a hot bed of coals, and the waste carbon will be burned. When the fresh fuel gets heated up, it may be pushed further back. From a practical point of view, these points mean no dead plates in a furnace to keep the air from going through coal or wood, a thin fire so that the air can get through easily. Place the fresh fuel where its smoke will have a chance to be burned, and do not cool off the furnace by putting on much fresh fuel at a time. Later, we will give more hints on firing. How heat is distributed. We have described heat as the movement of molecules back and forth at a high rate of speed. If these heated molecules beat against a solid like iron, its molecules are set in motion. One knocks the next, and so on. Just as you push one man in a crowd, he pushes the next, and so on till the push comes out on the other side. So heat passes through iron and appears on the other side. This is called conduction. All space is supposed to be filled with a substance in which heat, light, etc. may be transmitted, called the ether. When the molecules of a sheet of iron are heated or set vibrating, they transmit the vibration through the air or ether. This is called radiation. Heat is conducted through solid and liquid substances and radiated through gases. Now, some substances conduct heat readily, and some do so with the greatest difficulty. Iron is a good conductor. Carbon or soot on the flues of a boiler and lime or scale on the inside of a boiler are very poor conductors. So the heat will go through the iron and steel to the water in a boiler quickly and easily, and a large percent of the heat of the furnace will get to the water in a boiler. When a boiler is old and is clogged with soot and coated with lime, the heat cannot get through easily and goes off in the smokestack. The air coming out of the smokestack will be much hotter, and that extra heat is lost. Iron is a good radiator too, so if the outer shell of a boiler is exposed to the air, a great deal of heat will run off into space and be lost. Here, then, is where you need a non-conductor, as it is called, such as lime, wood, or the like. Economy says, cover the outside of a boiler shell with a non-conductor. This may be brickwork in a set boiler. In a traction boiler, it means a jacket of wood, plaster, hair, or the like. The steam pipe, if it passes through outer air, should be covered with felt, and the steam cylinder ought to have its jacket too. At the same time, all soot and all scale should be scrupulously cleaned away. Properties of steam. As we have already seen, steam is a gas. It is slightly blue in color, just as the water in the ocean is blue or the air in the sky. We must distinguish between steam and vapor. Vapor is small particles of water hanging in the air. They seem to stick to the molecules composing the air or hang there in minute drops. Water hanging in the air is, of course, water still. Its molecules do not have the movement that the molecules of a true gas do, such as steam is. Steam, moreover, has absorbed latent heat and has expansive force, but vapor has no latent heat and no expansive force. So vapor is dead and lifeless, while steam is live and full of energy to do work. When vapor gets mixed with steam, it is only in the way. It is a sort of dead weight that must be carried, and the steam power is diminished by having vapor mixed with it. Now, all steam, as it bubbles up through water in boiling, takes up with it a certain amount of vapor. Such steam is called wet steam. When the vapor is no longer in it, the steam is called dry steam. It is dry steam that does the best work, and that every engineer wants to get. While water will be taken up to great heights in the air and form clouds, in steam it will not rise very much. And at a certain height above the level of the water in a boiler, the steam will be much drier than near the surface. For this reason, steam domes have been devised so that the steam may be taken out at a point as high as possible above the water in the boiler, and so be as dry as possible. Also, dry tubes have been devised, which let the steam pass through many small holes that serve to keep back the water to a certain extent. However, there will be more or less moisture in all steam until it has been superheated, as it is called. This may be done by passing it through the hot part of the furnace, where the added heat will turn all the moisture in the steam into steam, and we shall have perfectly dry steam. The moment, however, that steam goes through a cold pipe, or one cooled by radiation, or goes into a cold cylinder, or a cylinder cooled by radiation, some of the steam will turn to water, or condense as it is called. So we have the same trouble again. Much moisture passing into the cylinder with the steam is called priming. In that case, the dead weight of water has become so great as to kill a great part of the steam power. How to use the expansive power of steam. We have said that the molecules in steam are always trying to get farther and farther apart. If they are free in the air, they will soon scatter, but if they are confined in a boiler or cylinder, they merely push out in every direction, forming pressure. When steam is let into the cylinder, it has the whole accumulated pressure in the boiler behind it, and of course that exerts a strong push on the piston. Shut off the boiler pressure, and the steam in the cylinder will still have its own natural tendency to expand. As the space in the cylinder grows larger with the movement of the piston from end to end, the expansive power of the steam becomes less and less, of course. However, every little helps, and the push this lessened expansive force exerts on the piston is so much energy saved. If the full boiler pressure is kept on the piston the whole length of the stroke, and then the exhaust port is immediately opened, all this expansive energy of the steam is lost. It escapes through the exhaust nozzle into the smokestack and is gone. Possibly, it cannot get out quickly enough and causes back pressure on the cylinder when the piston begins its return stroke, so reducing the power of the engine. To save this, the skilled engineer notches up his reverse lever, as they say. The reverse lever controls the valve travel. When the lever is in the last notch, the valve has its full travel. When the lever is in the center notch, the valve has no travel at all, and no steam can get into the cylinder. On the other side, the lever allows the valve to travel gradually, more and more in the opposite direction, so reversing the engine. As the change from one direction to the other direction is, of course, gradual, the valve movement is shortened by degrees and lets steam into the cylinder for a correspondingly less time. At its full travel, it perhaps lets steam into the cylinder for 3/4 of its stroke. For the last quarter, the work is done by the expansive power of the steam. Set the lever in the half notch, and the travel of the valve is so altered that steam can get into the cylinder only during half the stroke of the piston, the work during the rest of the stroke being done by the expansive force of the steam. Set the lever in the notch next to the middle notch, or the quarter notch, and steam will get into the cylinder only during 1/4 of the stroke of the piston, the work being done during 3/4 of the stroke by the expansive force of the steam. Obviously, the more the steam is expanded, the less work it can do. But when it escapes at the exhaust, there will be very little pressure to be carried away and lost. Therefore, when the load on his engine is light, the economical engineer will notch up his engine with the reverse lever, and will use up correspondingly less steam and save correspondingly more fuel. When the load is unusually heavy, however, he will have to use the full power of the pressure in the boiler, and the waste cannot be helped. The compound engine. The compound engine is an arrangement of steam cylinders to save the expansive power of steam at all times by letting the steam from one cylinder, where it is at high pressure, into another after it exhausts from the first, in this second cylinder, doing more work purely by the expansive power of the steam. The illustration shows a sectional view of a compound engine having 2 cylinders, one high pressure and one low. The low pressure cylinder is much larger than the high pressure. There is a single plate between them called the center head, and the same piston rod is fitted with 2 pistons, one for each cylinder. The steam chest does not receive steam from the boiler, but from the exhaust of the high-pressure cylinder. The steam from the boiler goes into a chamber in the double valve, from which it passes to the ports of the high-pressure cylinder. At the return stroke, the exhaust steam escapes into the steam chest, and from there it passes into the low-pressure cylinder. There may be one valve riding on the back of another, but the simplest form of compound engine is built with a single double valve, which opens and closes the ports for both cylinders at one movement. Theoretically, the compound engine should affect a genuine economy. In practice, there are many things to operate against this. Of course, if the steam pressure is low to start with, the amount of pressure lost in the exhaust will be small, but if it is very high, the saving in the low-pressure cylinder will be relatively large. If the work can be done just as well with a low pressure, it would be a practical waste to keep the pressure abnormally high in order to make the most of the compound engine. An engine must be a certain size before the saving of a compound cylinder will be appreciable. In these days, nearly all very large engines are compound, while small engines are simple. Another consideration to be taken into account is that a compound is more complicated and so harder to manage, and when any unfavorable condition causes loss, it causes proportionately more loss on a compound than on a simple engine. For these and other reasons, compound engines have been used less for traction purposes than simple engines have. It is probable that a skilled and thoroughly competent engineer who would manage his engine in a scientific manner would get more out of a compound than out of a simple, and this would be especially true in regions where fuel is high. If fuel is cheap and the engineer unskilled, a compound engine would be a poor economizer. Friction. We have seen that the molecules of water have a tendency to stick in the steam as vapor or moisture. All molecules that are brought into close contact have more or less tendency to stick together, and this is called friction. The steam as it passes along the steam pipe is checked to a certain extent by the friction on the sides of the pipe. Friction causes heat, and it means that the heat caused has been taken from some source of energy. The friction of the steam diminishes the energy of the steam. So too, the flywheel moving against the air suffers friction with the air, besides having to drive particles of air out of its path. All the moving parts of an engine, where one metal moves on another, suffer friction, since where the metals are pressed very tightly together, they have more tendency to stick than when not pressed so tightly. When iron is pressed too tightly, as under the blows of a hammer in a soft state, it actually welds together solidly. There is a great deal of friction in the steam cylinder, since the packing rings must press hard against the walls of the cylinder to prevent the steam from getting through. There is a great deal of friction between the D valve and its seat because of the high steam pressure on the back of the valve. There is friction in the stuffing boxes, both of the valve and the piston. There is friction at all the bearings. There are various ways in which friction may be reduced. The most obvious is to adjust all parts so nicely that they will bind as little as possible. The stuffing boxes will be no tighter than is necessary to prevent leaking of steam, and so with the piston rings. Journal boxes will be tight enough to prevent pounding, but no tighter. To obtain just the right adjustment requires great patience and the keen powers of observation and judgment. The makers of engines try to reduce friction as much as possible by using anti-friction metals in the boxes. Iron and steel have to be used in shafts, gears, etc., because of the strength that they possess. but there are some metals that stick to each other and to iron and steel, much less than iron or steel stick to each other when pressed close together. These metals are more or less soft, but they may be used in boxes and journal bearings. They are called anti-friction metals. The hardest for practical purposes is brass, and brass is used where there is much wear. Where there is less wear, various alloys of copper, tin, zinc, etc. may be used in the boxes. One of these is Babbitt metal, which is often used in the main journal box. All these anti-friction metals wear out rapidly, and they must be put in so that they can be adjusted or renewed easily. But the great anti-friction agent is oil. Oil is peculiar in that while the molecules seem to stick tightly together, and to a metal like iron or steel, they roll around upon each other with the utmost ease. An ideal lubricator is one that sticks so tight to the journal that it forms a sort of cushion all around it, and prevents any of its molecules coming into contact with the molecules of the metal box. All the friction then takes place between the different molecules of oil, and this friction is a minimum. The same principle has been applied to mechanics in the ball bearing. A number of little balls roll around between the journal and its box, preventing the two metals from coming into contact with each other, while the balls, being spheres, touch each other only at a single point, and the total space at which sticking can occur is reduced to a minimum. As is well known, there is great difference in oils. Some evaporate, like gasoline and kerosene, and so disappear quickly. Others do not stick tightly to the journal, so are easily forced out of place, and the metals are allowed to come together. What is wanted, then, is a heavy, sticky oil that will not get hard, but will also form a good cushion between bearings. Steam cylinders cannot be oiled directly, but the oil must be carried to the steam chest and cylinder in the steam. A good cylinder oil must be able to stand a high temperature. While it is diffused easily in the steam, it must stick tightly to the walls of the steam cylinder and to the valve seat and keep them lubricated. Once it is stuck to the metal, the heat of the steam should not evaporate it and carry it away. Again, a cylinder oil should not have any acid in it, which would have a tendency to corrode the metal. Nearly all animal fats do have some such acid. So tallow and the like should not be placed where they can corrode iron or steel. Lard and suet alone are suitable for use on an engine. When it comes to lubricating traction gears, other problems appear. A heavy grease will stick to the gears and prevent them from cutting, but it will stick equally to all sand and grit that may come along, and that, working between the cogs, may cut them badly. So some engineers recommend the use on gears of an oil that does not gather so much dirt. The friction of the valve on its seat due to the pressure of the steam on its back has given rise to many inventions for counteracting it. The most obvious of these is what is called the balanced valve. In the compound engine, where the steam pressure is obtained upon both sides of the valve, it rides much more lightly on its seat, so lightly indeed that when steam pressure is low, as in going downhill or operating under a light load, plunger pistons must be used to keep the valve down tight on its seat. The poppet valves were devised to obviate the undue friction of the D valve, but the same loss of energy is to a certain extent transferred, and the practical saving is not always equal to the theoretical. On large stationary engines, rotary valves and other forms, such as are used on the coreless engine, have come into common use, but they are too complicated for a farm engine, which must be as simple as possible, with least possible liability of getting out of order. And with that statement and the end of Chapter 10, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Farm Engines and How to Run Them, The Young Engineer's Guide, which once again has surprised me with its very clear explanations of complicated topics. That was some excellent science, except for that ether part. Never mind that. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many illustrations and cutaways, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.